So it's nice to have you here. Thanks for coming on the channel. And I know you've made one appearance so far. We did that Saturn and the Goat Gods, I believe, sort of chat presentation during winter.
Yeah,
And so
you
my
came over to my
audience,
channel. Did you like co-stream it or something
I
on your
did.
channel too? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I did. So some of my audience knows who you are, but I love it for you just to give a quick intro on what you're all about and how people can find your work and everything.
Okay. Well, what I'm all about is that's an interesting question. Um, as a kid, like I never really fit in, like a lot of people who kind of wind up in the world that we're in. But I was also kind of a mainstream kid too. Like I had a lot of mainstream interests. Like I really loved sports. I played a lot of sports. I was into like, fast cars as a kid. I rode dirt bikes. And, I grew up in the 70s. So when 1970 hit, I was 10 years old. And my formative years were spent in the Bay Area. Um, so I moved to California in 1965 from New Jersey. And I remember my time in New Jersey. But when I got to California, a year later, like the summer of love thing starts to happen. We're living, within a stone's throw of San Francisco, maybe 12 miles from San Francisco. And as a kid, I could feel it, right? Like there was something vibrationally in the air. And I can't necessarily describe it or quantify it, but the atmosphere was charged. It was alive. And I really liked a lot of the music from that time as a kid listening to the radio. So I'll never forget, I was walking through the elementary school parking lot and, parents pick up their kids and somebody had the window down and the birds were playing. And, there's a season, turn. Wait, I remember hearing that going, wow, this is a really interesting song, right? I could feel the song. I could feel sort of, and then all the symbolism, you would love this because all the symbolism was bountiful. Psychedelia was everywhere. Kids would draw peace signs, right? Not every kid, but some of the kids who had like hippie parents, would draw peace signs and stuff, right? So that was kind of in the air. It was like, it was tangible, and we would go to places like San Francisco and you could kind of feel the summer of love. But the weird thing was, this is part of the other side of me, is I didn't really like hippies. So I could feel everything and I liked the music and I could feel the vibe, but I didn't really like hippies. Like hippies didn't really interest me. Like I never aspired to be a hippie. And in fact, I was probably like a little right winger, right? So that kind of is an encapsulation of me in some ways. Like I have a very alternative side, but I also have another side that doesn't conform in that way. Just because like, the trends or whatever, like, and it happens frequently. Like I was kind of in the middle of like the San Francisco electronic music scene in the mid 90s to the late 90s. This is when the whole tech world was just blowing up and they just had stupid money
Right.
through DJs. And at that time, there was this interesting kind of confluence between like computer culture, cybernetics, geeks, nerds, and electronic music.
Right.
And like I really dug it. I thought this is really, really interesting because these people were exploring, Terrence McKenna territory and Robert Anton Wilson. And I'm like, oh, I like this, right? But then, it starts to morph into this kind of trance music scene. And I'm like, I kind of dig the music, but I'm not really digging the scene because it feels very robotic, kind of dispossessed. People don't dance with each other. They're all their own little worlds, kind of twirling around, waiting for the drop. Right? I'm like, what's going on here? It feels very programmable in a lot of ways. So I would come into these kind of places in my life, and I would resonate with some of it, but not all of it. Even like the new age thing, Like, you know, that was really big in the Bay Area in the 1980s and 90s. So there were a lot of interesting things that came out of that period of time. There were some very interesting thinkers like William Irwin Thompson and a lot of people that people just don't know about. But the way that the scene kind of morphed into this, you know, kind of polyamorous goddess worship thing, I'm like, I don't want any part of this, right? Like, I like the ideas and I like some of the cultural aesthetics that go along with it, but once it like kind of took shape and form into something else, I was like, I'm not down with it, you know. So that kind of, I'm kind of anachronistic in a lot of ways. I mean, that's how I would describe myself. You know, I live in Texas where everybody is pretty much a Christian, right? But I'm an astrologer, and you know, I'm like the devil here. You know, I'm like
Right.
I'm like the devil incarnate. In fact, I ran for city council in a town called Fredericksburg, and one of the guys I was running against in the middle of like, you know, like the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, and was it the not the Rotary Club, but you know, so they have their forums, right? They have their platforms.
Sure.
So it was like during COVID, it was virtual. So I'm in the Democratic Party platform. And this guy ahead of me who I thought I actually had a bond with. Like I thought he and I were like, you know, kind of on the same page, right? With, you know, seeing how, you know, the local world worked and, you know, how the larger global sort of oppression and tyranny worked. Well, he jumps me during this conference, and he calls me like, you know, a Satanist, and he says that I have a cult, and he's like telling people not to vote for me, right? I'm like, oh. And I have to go next after he's done, right? So I'm like, what do I do with this, you know? And I didn't even address it. I just like moved on and tried to do my platform, whatever. And then I had found that he and these other people who were from the Republican Party had been on an attack mode on me. And there was this guy who was connected to the Tea Party, and they were attacking him. Look, oh, if you're a Christian, how do you support him? Right? And like some of those guys, I don't think they really cared, but they were using it as like a cudgel, right? So I did the election. I even ran into his wife one day. This is before that whole thing went down. And we had a nice conversation. I told her I really like your husband. And there was the checker. I said, you live here? She said, yeah. I said, well, if you're going to vote, you should think about voting for me and her husband. Right? Like I said that in line. It was like, I got no beef with the guy. So the election happens. We both lose. And I'll have to hand it to him, though. He called me up after the election, and he said, you know, you ran a really good campaign. And I respect that. I was like, we're good, right? We're good. But that's the, you know, sort of the anachronism, right? So here in Texas, I would be considered the devil. But in California, because I don't have like typical progressive, you know, baked in allegiance to a certain political dogma, I get rejected coming the other way. So I think if you want to ask me who I am, I'm an anachronism. I'm an anomaly. I'm a paradox. And some people just want to put, you know, people in a box, right? Like I could talk geopolitics with anybody on the internet at a high level, but they won't have me on their show because I'm an astrologer, right? Like that automatically disqualifies me. And, you know, in the astrology world, there aren't a lot of people, again, who would embrace, you know, the things that I kind of navigate through. So I'm not really entirely welcome in their world, right? So I started doing astrology in heavily in 2008. And it was a byproduct of doing a blog post on Sarah Palin's astrological chart. Because I wanted to know who she was, right? So I did this blog post, and I looked at my stats. I'm like, whoa, because I had this blog that I was kind of exploring at that time, and I'm like, man, look at all these hits. I should stay with this astrological stuff, right? So I kept going in that direction, and then that's when Obama was running for president, and I did this post on Obama, which to this day I'm still really proud of that post, because it's that image of Obama where he's on the beach and he's coming out of the water. I don't know if you've ever seen that image.
Yeah.
It's a very early image of Obama. And I'm like, oh, well, look at this, right? It's like he's emerging from our collective unconscious.
Oh,
right?
interesting.
He's literally coming out of the sea, and he's bright and he's shiny, right? It's almost like, like a baptism of sorts, right? And I'm like, this is the perfect image if you are a myth maker that you want to have people associated with Obama. And also the sea takes us into the whole Piscean realm and the Piscean age, and invariably we end up with Jesus, right? So it was just really, that was a loaded, rich, psychologically enhanced image. So I just took off and I started to, write more about these things. And I was looking at astrology from a different place than other astrologers were. I was not into like astrological dogma. And a lot of astrologers at that time were, very new agey, right? They were really new agey, warm and fuzzy. And I remember being on a very early astrological forum page on Facebook with, some fairly well-known astrologers at that time. And I didn't relate to any of them really, maybe a little, a few, right? I was like, yeah, this is not my scene. And then I discovered all of these Black astrologers on Facebook. And I really liked those people. Like, they were cool. They were open, right? Like, they would talk about anything. And they were really, really good. They were really good astrologers. So I kind of matriculated into that world for a while. It's like, oh, yeah, I feel accepted here. And then, Trayvon Martin happened, and then Michael Brown happened, Obama happened, and all that went to hell. And all these guys, they were just like, and women too, but mostly guys, they were like, we got to take care of business. I mean, they were really starting to preach violence. And I mean, I don't know, maybe I'd be doing the same. I don't know. Right. But it was like, and I would try to talk to them and say, look, you're being played. Like, you're being played. You're being psychologically manipulated, and you don't even know it. And they weren't hearing any of it. So
interesting.
I had to tap out on that. But
gotcha.
Yeah, that's kind of, it's a brief snippet of who I am.
No, that's fantastic. And I can identify with a lot of aspects of it. Kind of straddling two worlds, something along those lines. I feel the same way. I mean, right now, a lot of what I'm reading about has to do with tradition and the meaning of tradition, and the West kind of being an anti-tradition society in some ways, always about progress and, forward movement and things like that, kind of destroying our history. And it's funny because I'm really interested in this material, especially the metaphysics related to ancient traditions and things like that. There's a few authors that I'm really diving into right now, and that really contrasts, say, some of the films that I'm interested, or the music that I like to listen to and things like that, where sometimes I'm like, who am I? I like all this material over here, but then artistically, aesthetically, I like some of this other stuff. And so I've always felt like I'm somewhere in the middle, or I'm just too extreme. I'm beyond the left and I'm beyond the right in a lot of different ways, with how I tend to see things. And so I feel like I can't really be easily categorized too in that way. So that makes a lot of sense. The Bay Area, oh my goodness, there's so much to talk about with that. I'm sure you've really done a deep dive into some of the occult stuff going on over there. But that was something for a long time where I was fascinated with, the Temple of Set and Church of Satan, and, Michael Aquino and the Presidio military base, and the fact that, if I'm not mistaken, Star Trek too, isn't there like main sort of location?
Except the Presidio, yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the transhuman thing, the tech hippie thing is really fascinating. I remember watching a documentary about tech hippies, and it's just what an interesting sort of contrast too between these guys, what they looked like, what they were interested in, the drugs that they were doing, but they were creating the internet as an example,
Yep.
essentially, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
yeah, interesting exposure with all of that stuff. The
You have
black
this. You have the
conscious,
psychedelic movement, right?
yeah, oh yeah, yeah,
Right. So
absolutely,
that
one hundred
happens.
percent.
Yeah.
For
Yeah.
sure, for sure. So that's a whole deep weave. Charles Manson was a deep weave that I got really interested in for a while, mainly through my fiance. She's really interested in everything having to do with Manson. She's probably read like every book there is on him and what he was up to. He didn't consider himself a hippie either, by the way.
Right.
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 And
Yeah. I
so
get that. Yeah.
yeah, so he was anti-hippie, even though most people, when they look at him, they think, obviously that he was a hippie. You mentioned the Black conscious community. That was something too that became of interest to me, and I realized that a lot of the subject matter and some of the things that different teachers were discussing were like way ahead of the curve with
Way ahead of
other
time.
people
Yeah.
that I was looking into and everything else. Right.
Steve Coakley. Right. Way ahead
That
of
was
the curve.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, very interesting. And then when
I
did
tell
you start? Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, Mario. No,
No,
the
please.
thing I wanted to touch on real quick
Yeah, go
about the
ahead.
Bay Area, like growing up in the Bay Area. Like I'm 9 years old, I'm 10 years old, and we're walking around with the Zodiac killer.
Right.
Like I'm literally walking home from school. It's kind of, man, is the Zodiac killer out today? Like that's like floating around in our brains. And there was always something really radical happening in the Bay Area. It was like freaking ground zero.
Mm.
But you had the Black Panthers, you had Angela Davis, you had shootouts at courts, you had the Indians taking over Alcatraz. I mean, this stuff was happening all the time in the Bay Area. It was crazy. Like I did a couple of segments on my show about all that stuff that was happening in the Bay Area from like the late 60s up through really the assassination of Moscone and Milk, which is kind of the culmination of that period. You have the People's Temple with Jim Jones, like they're heavily involved. They're sending people down into San Francisco to help Moscone get elected. There's a strong connection with Willie Brown and Jim Jones, right? And Jim Jones is like this really weird guy who's kind of, a CIA asset, but he's also like a Marxist. He's also deeply into mind control.
Mm-hmm.
And Jim Jones was rising up the political ladder very quickly in San Francisco. So you're just like, if we're playing the Kevin Bacon game, you're 2 degrees of separation from Kamala Harris and Jim Jones, right? So it was crazy. All this stuff is going on as I'm growing up. So I'm kind of being, baptized in this very weird world of a lot of these very dark occurrences that I wasn't really scared of, but I was pretty interested in. Like, why are these things happening? What's going on here? And this is what happens with anybody. You grow up during a certain time, and the milieu that you're in, shapes you in a lot of ways. So, yeah, that was kind of fertile ground of like, my daily life.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Very, very interesting. The Zodiac Killer. Yeah, I can't. His name is escaping me. The guy who did Fight Club, the director who did Fight Club. Did you see his Zodiac Killer film, and what'd you think?
I did, and I'd actually like to see it again because it was a very procedural film in a lot of ways, right? Like, there when you get into like detective stuff, sometimes it's shoot 'em up and some procedural, and then there's like procedural. So I need to see it again. I'd like to see it again.
Right. The last time I saw it, I believe I really enjoyed it. That's what I remember, is just really digging it and thinking it was well made and everything else. But yeah, no, thank you for sharing all of that. That's fascinating. I've long wanted to do more research on the Bay Area and how it kind of fits into everything. Just like you said, ground zero. It is a ground zero. It's on the West Coast, obviously, and its cultural influence is absolutely huge. And then what it's turned into as well is pretty interesting, right?
Yeah. It's turned into this weird kind of hybrid of Silicon Valley, very deep money, DARPA
Mm-hmm.
projects, right? That and then you're really trading on the sort of leftist and alternative culture that they've incubated there as well,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you have that going on in San Francisco, which you can see that happening when just prior to like Harvey Milk showing up, and there's this guy named Harry Hay who was one of the planners of the Stonewall riot in
Mm.
New York, and he was a communist, and he was also very much connected to the acting world
Mm.
in Southern California. In fact, Will Geer from the Waltons played Grandpa Walton. Will Geer was his lover, his real life lover, right? So he starts this thing called the Mattachine Society,
Hmm.
and it's a very weird group of intense, kind of hardcore homosexuals that have an agenda,
Mm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And their agenda is to wipe out straight culture. Like that's their agenda. So they wind up moving their office right to San Francisco, and that becomes a landing spot for a lot of the gay culture that moves into San Francisco
Oh,
and becomes a political powerhouse in terms of voting bloc and money. There's a huge amount of money that flows through to this day the gay community. So they hold a lot
sure.
of political sway, right? So they're responsible for a huge amount of what takes place in San Francisco. And then you have Willie Brown who comes in. And Willie Brown is an interesting character because, on the one hand, he seems like a champion of the people, right, and minorities, but he's really not. Willie Brown is a corporatist developer. And when he was the mayor of San Francisco, it went through a heavy duty corporate makeover with commercial real estate and displacing lots of people,
Mm.
right? So he will trade on minority votes, right? Whether that minority is in the Mission District or the Fillmore, Western Addition, Candlestick Point, he'll trade those votes in for his ability to displace those people,
Mm.
and that's exactly what happened. There's an article up over on rents.com by I think his name is Shimatsu. And it's a really interesting article. And it talks about how Kamala Harris was involved in essentially getting young men off the streets of San Francisco in the Western Addition and the Fillmore district. And there was a district attorney who was a public defender who would fight her in court and get these guys kind of back into, back on the streets. Now, a lot of these guys were either drug dealers, sold weed, whatever, right? But it was through their either jobs or jobs plus that they were able to essentially keep these houses in the Western Addition and the Fillmore district, right? But this guy gets killed, and there's nobody there to defend these guys. So Harris runs through them like a meat grinder, and all these guys wind up in jail, and now they can't pay the mortgage or
Mm.
or the rent,
Mm.
right, or the insurance on their places, and they get evicted. And now all of a sudden you have Willie Brown coming in with corporate development, right, and the mixed use facilities and all that stuff. So that's another part of San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
And Yeah, it's just weird, man. It's just a weird, weird place. It's really a cult, right? It's super occult beneath the surface of things. You mentioned the Temple of Set. You mentioned Anton LaVey,
Hmm.
right? There's a reason they all matriculate to San Francisco. It's a really very trippy place. And, I have to think that some of this Tartarian stuff, which is bubbling beneath the surface of San Francisco, plays kind of a role, in maybe the geomancy of the place. It's like there was something else going on there a long time ago,
Oh yeah,
right?
definitely. Hmm.
Yeah,
For sure. No, just geographically, it would make sense that that would be the case too,
yeah.
right? And so, one of the things I think about too, as well, is this um, sort of manifest destiny moving westward, and things like that, and the migration of people, and then even in the 60s, younger people from like the Midwest and the East Coast going west and literally going to San Francisco. That's something that is really fascinating to think about, how many young people just got up and left and wanted to join sort of the scene. And then also too, the other thing that has to be explained, I think, as well, right? That I know you understand very well, but a lot of these musicians and some of these key actors and stuff like that, that they weren't exactly what you thought they were, right? That
No,
there's a contrived aspect with a lot of these bands, and just the music industry, in general. That's one of the things that my fiance really, really got into as well, because that was her music that she loved. She grew up with it. She kind of self-identified as a hippie for many, many years, and then eventually she started looking into like the work of Dave McGowan, who I'm
David
sure you're
Gowan, the great
right.
David Gowan.
Yeah, weird scenes in the canyon and stuff like that, and realizing that a lot of these bands, and a lot of the people that she idolized, that there was a sort of construct aspect to the whole entire
That's a
thing.
crush. That's a crush. And
Right, right,
right, you go, oh, well, no, not that.
right.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly.
Well, you bring up
Yeah.
a good point because there's two songs that are really associated with San Francisco and California in general.
Hmm.
And they kind of come out of the same thing that you're not kind of they do. They come out of the same thing that you're talking about. So one song is Scott McKenzie, which is I have Mario. I have to. I'll be right back. Don't go anywhere.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, yeah,
I'll
go
be
for it.
right back. Just
Sure,
stay here. This happens once every time I do this. I'll be right back.
sure, sure. You're fine.
Yeah. So to your point, right? To your point. I forget the reasons. To your point, Scott McKenzie writes that song. If you're going to San Francisco, right? Put a flower in your hair. Like that is a freaking advertisement. Right? That's like mind control. Like go to San Francisco. Go to San Francisco. And then if you go further south, you run into the Mamas and the Papas, and they do the song California Dreaming. Right?
Mm.
So you get it coming both ways. You either get the Mamas and the Papas, or you get Scott McKenzie. But yeah, there's tons of programming getting people to uproot their lives and then go west. Absolutely.
Right, right, 100%. And actually, one of the things I've gotten into with this, I think it's really fascinating that my personal opinion, if people have watched enough of my stuff, they'll know that I have a reverence for the North and like Northern symbolism, what can be called polar symbolism. There's an ancient idea that people basically came from a northern location and returned to a northern location, and that the North Star was once like the main star in the heavens, and that there was an ancient sky clock in the northern sky that consisted of Ursa Major and Minor and Draco and things like that. And so I've gone on and on and on about all of this for, years now. And one of the things that's really interesting, I've read before some authors put out the idea that the North symbolically kind of is almost a code for the center, right? So almost, if no matter what your cosmology is, basically, if you look at Earth from a top-down perspective, the North would be in the center, right? There's a correspondence and a relationship with the North Pole and the Pole Star and things like that, the North Star, and that this location is a primary sort of thing that all humans almost have in their DNA. And that when people declare a center of the world, whether it's Mecca or Jerusalem or something along these lines, they're actually mirroring this original northern dynamic. Some authors have said that these are secondary locations, but the primary sort of principal location would be at the north. There's a whole bunch of people now online saying that the north too is where the original location of the Garden of Eden is. Our buddy Longo from Old World Florida, he gets into a lot of this stuff as well, and that Florida was once known as this Garden of Eden sort of location. I see that as still mirroring a lot of this sort of primary location business at the north. But anyways, some people have said that the West became the new North, and that propagandists and agents and things like that use sort of some symbolism related to this northern sort of dynamic and actually put it onto the West. And so the West became this new sort of pilgrimage location where the North for a lot of peoples actually was that. And when you declare a center of the world and a homeland, that in a way you're kind of symbolically saying that this is my true north, right? That this relates to my sort of guiding star, you know, the place from which we came from, but then also return to. And so that the West kind of turned into this, going westward, the whole idea of like a gold rush and everything else, and that there's going to be prosperity to the West. I saw some really old, very interesting illustrations of like angels leading people to the West.
Oh,
right?
wow.
And people in caravans like following these angels and things like that.
Wow.
Yeah. So I think it's pretty fascinating. So I think San Francisco played a part in all of that too. This new frontier, right?
Yep, definitely. And supposedly the time period for that is 1849, right? Like that's when it's all theoretically happening.
Exactly.
With the gold rush. The evolution of California from San Francisco originally was not even called San Francisco, right? Originally it was called Yerba Buena, and then eventually it becomes San Francisco, but that's not what its original name was. But the theoretical explosion of population in the so-called Barbary Coast and servicing the gold country. Now, if you really think about it, getting from San Francisco to the gold country, it's not that easy back in the day, right? Like you literally had to, not impossible, but you had to cross the bay, right? So you had to deal with water. And then once you got to the other side, you had probably about a 250-mile trek to get to the mother lode in the gold country. And once you got into like the Sierra foothills, like that is not easy navigating. There's no roads, there's no trails, right? And they're supposed to go there with, covered wagons and horses, and so even that you have to calculate that into this whole idea. Well, you could say, well, they just went to the gold country first and then migrated to San Francisco, but that's not always the case, right? Some of those people came by boat, theoretically. Like there's just so many things that don't really add up when you look at the start of San Francisco. It doesn't add up. And if you look at a lot of the very, very early pictures of San Francisco, it's like completely developed,
right?
Like completely blown out already. Like, how do you do that? I mean, even if you had, let's say, I don't know, 5,000 Chinese workers at your disposal, right? There's a thing called a language barrier, right? You're going to have to tell these guys what to do in order to, build that stuff, right? And then you're going to need like master craftsmen, master masons. You're going to need all the materials. Where are you going to get the materials from? Are they going to come cross country, wagon train, right? Are they going to come around the Horn with a ship? I mean, all that stuff never really gets talked about because it's just complete. It looks like it's completely built up, and stuff looks very old, right? And then they have the fire and the earthquake and the fire. Well, that takes care of that business, doesn't it? But there's still remnants of stuff there. And before, a lot of the stuff started to get talked about on a lot of the channels, I used to go to the Palace of Fine Arts all the time in San Francisco. Even if there was no event there, like I would just go there and hang out because I felt like it was very different than other places. I mean, that's not far from the Presidio, by the way. It's like blocks away from the Presidio. So if we're talking about the Presidio and we're talking about like this whole, Tartaria thing, whatever it was, right? The Presidio is part of the conversation.
Right.
And right. Again, just blocks away. So anyway, yeah, man. I mean, there's just so much high strange about San Francisco, really from start to finish, and even where it is now.
Definitely. Yeah. Someone's probably already on it, but there's all these channels now where people are really deconstructing the state that they live in or the city that they live in, and they're looking at it through this sort of lens, this old world sort of lens. And San Francisco would be the perfect location for someone to do that. And like I said, someone's probably already on it. There's probably already videos out there. I haven't looked into it, but I can only imagine that it's literally a gold mine, or a figurative gold mine, rather, of information and bizarre stuff.
Totally.
Yeah, so for people who don't know about your astrological services, I'm kind of curious, like, what would you consider to be your specialty when it comes to astrology?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I really enjoy just working with people in their charts and like transits and, where they are, what's happening, where they're going, looking at areas of growth, areas of opportunity. I really see the chart as a map and kind of a guide to a person's life. I really enjoy that. I also really I'm really good at relocation stuff. And helping people find places to live in. So yeah, I've always enjoyed that. And I do I'll do other things than just like a relocated chart. I'll look at, let's say they're moving to they want to move to, I don't know, Santa Fe, right? So I'll look at Santa Fe's chart because most of these cities are charter, right? So I'll look at their chart, if they're chartered, they usually are. And even if I don't know the time of the charter, there is a date, and I could look at that date, cast a chart, and I could put it on top of an individual's chart because all those planets are going to line up, right? In a synastry chart, doesn't matter, right? Like, okay, this is here, and that chart is the anchor for the other chart. And in some cases, some cities and some states actually have actual times associated with that. So I'll look at that as well as the individual's chart. So we're looking at not just the relocated chart and some of the astrocartography, but also like the area itself.
Okay, gotcha. Excellent. And there's so many things to know with astrology. All of my friends that are astrologers, just amateur astrologers, they always have some new thread that they're pulling at, right? Oh, I'm just learning about this, or I'm learning about that, and it's some new weave that they're kind of adding to their arsenal with everything. And I'm always interested in just listening to them. I'm like, most of it, to be honest with you, I'm like, I'm not even aware of that, but that sounds cool. What sort of have you added to your toolkit over the last handful of years, or like, what's a new wrinkle that you're sort of interested in these days?
It's a really good question.
It's probably very nuanced, I would imagine, because you've been doing it for a little while here.
So I'll give you my philosophy of astrology.
Yeah.
So Brian Eno, whom I really respect a lot, just in terms of his musicianship. I don't think about his politics, whatever, right? But in terms of his musicianship and creativity, I think he's a genius. And there's this documentary that he did based on a deck of cards he created called Oblique Strategies. And in the documentary, he says, give me 5 really good options versus a dozen mediocre ones. Right. And when I heard that, like, that really resonated with me. And so for me, I wouldn't say I'm like vanilla, but for me, I have a set of tools that I use and that I know inside and out, right? Like the best options for me are understanding like the triplicities or understanding angularity, right? Like if you understand the basics and fundamentals of astrology, right, inside and out and thoroughly, all these other things are interesting, but I'm not sure they always add to whatever it is that you need to communicate with an individual, right? So I am kind of a less is more guy, and the reason I like to do that is because I have a fairly well-honed intuition. So for me, those tools, those basic tools allow me to have an intuitive relationship with the material. So those are just jumping off points for me, right? But they're the foundation of what I do. So, you know, for a while, I did not get into asteroids, right? I'm like, I'm not an asteroid guy. But then I started reading, and when I say asteroids, I'm talking about like primary asteroids, like Vesta and Juno and Pallas and Ceres, right? Like, okay, I'm going to incorporate asteroids into my mix because I felt like they were really important in a different way. So I incorporated asteroids. I do some fixed star stuff, but I feel like the challenge with the fixed star stuff is twofold. Like you can just get crazy, like even with asteroids, like there's all these crazy asteroids, right? Like there's thousands of asteroids, and you could have an asteroid that represents something, right? And it's like, oh, there's this, and it's on your Venus. And it's like, okay, well, that's kind of interesting, but what does that really mean, right? Like, does that speak to the heart of the person, what they're going through, or, is just another layer of interpretation that, that we have to explore, right? So even with the fixed star stuff, and you start to play with all the fixed stars, like there's just more layers of interpretation. And I'm not against fixed stars. I do use fixed stars, but I'm limited with the fixed stars that I use. I mean, that's kind of how I roll. And the other thing with fixed stars is that a lot of times they're really fatalistic. Like, oh, you're born under a bad star. Oh, you've got sheep conjunct your Venus. You're screwed, right? Like, who really wants to hear that? Like, you forget it. Give up on relationships, right? So I don't like fatalistic astrology, and you get that with fixed stars. They're fixed, right? Like that's how they operate. So I use them, but they're not a big part of my toolkit. So I guess, I'm kind of boring. I guess I'm the missionary position of astrology. But my thing is, if you learn those things really, 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 really well, like you don't have to learn a whole lot more, right? Because they will provide you with everything you need to understand a person's chart. So one of the things I would stress, as I went through a whole period where I was teaching a lot of people astrology, it's like one of the things that I would stress is to feel into the aspect. Like, what does it feel like? What's it feel like to have a Mars-Saturn square? That person has a Mars-Saturn square in the chart. What does that feel like? Well, you feel into it, right? And you interpret from that place. It's like, wow, that's intense. That's hard, right? It's frustrating, like, so, like, I stress that. Like when I look at a chart, I try to, and I've done thousands of charts. So sometimes maybe I wouldn't say I go on automatic pilot, but it's easy for me to kind of like, do the math and, kind of intuitively snap into it. Right. But if you can feel into that stuff, that's a whole nother level of astrology.
For sure.
Because now you're having a relational experience with that person, and you can begin to interpret that aspect, not entirely from their point of view, but you can begin to experience it from their point of view. And even with something like I don't know, like a moon Jupiter trine, right? You can get in there and you can feel elated, right? You can feel elated and kind of giddy in a sense that anything is possible, if you align your emotional body, with the potential of Jupiter, right? Like, oh, you're a dreamer, right? You can dream, you're a dreamer. And if you, emotionally charge your dreams, right? You believe in your dreams and you see serendipity and you see coincidence, in the hand of the universe behind things that you do. Wow, isn't that exciting, right? Isn't that provident, So it's not always like the heavy part or the tense parts, but there's also the expansive parts that are there as well.
Gotcha. Right. Excellent answer. I love that. I feel like I can identify with that too. I'm a less is more tarot reader. I think that that's more of my style. And when it comes to symbolism, what I've tried to do is really get the fundamentals down, like really, really, really down.
Yep.
But the fundamentals are the deepest things you can actually learn.
That's right.
The symbolism of the square, the symbolism of the circle, or the dot, or numerology, or whatever it is. And so I found that that's my approach too, is I want to know the basics, but like really, 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 really well. And I feel as though there's a lot of people who don't do that, and they're maybe decoding things and interpreting things symbolically. And I think people should do whatever they want to do with whatever they're comfortable with. But sometimes I think some of these people could get a little bit more if they knew some of the basics and knew some of the fundamentals and were actually really passionate about it as well. Because I think a lot of people are, it's really kind of appealing to want to dive into the deep end of decoding like hardcore occult symbolism and things like that. But when you have the basics down, you're going to get way more out of all of the things that you're kind of observing and looking at. Which is why I started Symbolic Studies, so that I can actually really get the basics of the symbolism of each sign pretty much down. I realized that if I really wanted to be a sort of competent symbologist, then I really need to know the signs. And so that's what I've, pretty much committed myself to, is really studying these signs, during each sign,
Oh,
obviously.
you do a magnificent job. I mean, your comprehension is like, really deep, profound, and putting it all together. It's very cool. I always repost your stuff on my
I see it. Yeah. Thanks, man.
Yeah.
No, I appreciate it. So there's a few things I want to get around to, but we might be jumping off the deep end with some of it. So I'd love for you to have an opportunity to talk about Harvest Moon 2024 and maybe a little bit about, you putting on these events and what people maybe could experience should they attend.
Okay. Well, it all started, I think, around 2018, and I was at a bookstore. Maybe it could have been it might have been 2017, 2018, somewhere around. And I was at a bookstore in Newtown, Pennsylvania. So I was there and I was doing readings with people. And this guy shows up and he's with his wife and he says, "Hey man, I'm so happy to meet you. I've been listening to you for a long time." So, because I've been doing this from the blog side of things since 2008 and from the podcast side since 2010. So he'd been listening to me for a long time. And I'd always kind of teased like, hey, we should, go from virtual to physical one of these days. And, I'll have an event somewhere. And so he kind of put the bug in my ear. He said, "Man, if you have an event, I will go." I'm like, "Okay, here you go. I'll do it." Right. So I had an event and he didn't go.
Classic.
It's Ryan. Yeah. And Ryan's great. He's been to every event since then, by the way. So it started, my first one was in 2012. 2019. I did it in October of 2019. And it's like, okay, I'm committed to this now. And I started, I like, well, how do I want to do it? Do I want to rent a space? I went through all these different options. And eventually I found this hotel in Kerrville, which is currently where I am. And I really liked their setup. They had full banquet facilities, so we could eat, right? And the first year we had this one room. This is a hotel that's built for conferences. So we had this one room at the end of the hotel. But ever since then, we've had this other room, which is really a very cool room because it's right next to this kind of rotunda and it's right next to where we all eat. So we have this very centralized area together. And the first year, there were a lot of people that were there. Like everybody was very hungry to meet each other, right? And I'm like, okay, I've got to do something really, really special, right? So I went way over the top. Like I invited a friend of mine from California who plays the didgeridoo, and he came out, and I rented out this small church in Fredericksburg, and we had a performance there. It was like our church for the night. I rented that. I rented buses. Took the buses to Enchanted Rock, this really huge, massive rock, kind of in the park in the middle of nowhere. Like I spent so much money and lost a ton of money that year because I didn't want people to feel like they were getting gypped, right? So I learned a lot. And the next year was the COVID year, but everybody loved it, right? The next year was the COVID year. And I was really committed to creating a space where people, could choose not to wear their masks. It was like you could, come to this event and, you're going to be free, right? Not only going to be free, but we're going to have a bunch of cool stuff for you to do.
Yeah.
And I was a little smarter. I didn't rent the buses. I was a little smarter about the event. And one of the things that I did was I took the group to a shooting range. And I'm like, I wonder how many of these people have fired a gun before. And I'm like, let's set this up. And I actually had somebody who kind of helped me out with that because I wouldn't have been able to do it without that person. So we went to this shooting range. It was all 22 platform, three different rifles. But it was cool, right? I wanted to get people kind of out of their comfort zone a little bit. And then they have this thing here called you should visit it while you're here, called the Stonehenge of the Hill Country.
Okay.
And it's a replica of Stonehenge. And it's just down the road from the hotel. So that year I created a ritual around the mask, right? Where people would enter this inner circle of this Stonehenge, right? And my girlfriend Joan was there, and we had masks for people. And these masks were these plastic masks that had holes in the eyes, but nothing else, right? And so she was there. And as you went into the Stonehenge, she handed everybody a mask. And then we went around the inside of the circle 3 times. And I actually found like locational points. And one of them was to the north. When we exited, right? When we exited the inside of that circle, we exited towards the northwest. And so then Joan was there to take the mask off, right? So this was like an intentional ritual about the mask. Yeah. But it was also about like dropping our masks for the event.
Sure.
Right. So I did that year. It was a really cool year. They've all been great. They've all been very different. But the one constant theme that has run through it all is everybody falls in love with each other. Right. Like it's for me, it's like a temporary autonomous zone and kind of a mini opportunity to experience something that's very Aquarian, where there's no hierarchies, right? I may be the person that sets up the time and the schedule, right? I may be the master of ceremonies, but there are so many big personalities that attend this event that, it's kind of like, well, and people go off and sometimes they do their own thing. Most of the time they stick with the program, but it's just a very cool environment. We've had relationships start like during this event, and people wind up becoming, really close, really, really close friends. And, I love it. It's like a pollinator in a lot of ways.
Right. Yeah, no, it sounds like it.
No, yeah. And the weather here at that time of year is really good. Usually we're like the second week in October. This week we moved it up a week earlier. So it may be a little bit warmer than usual. The hotel itself is, kind of old school, feels like kind of the 50s meets the 70s, right? But it's super, super clean and really comfortable. And it's got a really big Olympic-sized pool, has a hot tub. The grounds have a lot of flora. So it's just got a really nice, lush vibe to it. And the food, it's banquet food, but it's really good banquet food. And it's representative of the hill country. So you'll get barbecue, you'll get Tex-Mex. We do a brunch. So you get 3 meals, 3 dinners, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Sunday brunch, me and Joan, we go out, we buy all kinds of really healthy snacks like grass-fed beef jerky and organic apples and purified water and, organic sort of, dried fruit and nut mix, stuff like that. Some protein bars, really good protein bars. So you can just snack on that stuff during the day. Like we take care of all of that as well. And we usually have some entertainment. This year we have DJ Pebbles, who is also known as Laura Guerin. And Laura used to be a supermodel. And she's from Brazil. And so she came up with Gisele Bundchen, and they were supermodel roommates. And she's been to the event before. So she'll be here again this year. She's also a DJ, right? She's a club DJ. So on Saturday night, we fire that up, and I get a bunch of like back shit and try to play with it and have fun. So there's a lot of fun that takes place as well. Of course, you'll be there.
Yep. And
really looking forward to you taking us on a symbolic journey, which will be really cool. And I'll do a presentation, and then Darlena Watson has sort of popped in as our human design person. And it's
cool.
like we have a human design Sunday, and Darlena's great. And she'll be doing a presentation on Sunday. And I'm thinking that maybe we, depending upon how this interview goes and this person's availability, might do a bit of an offsite if it's possible. And I might even bring him in to do some speaking as well. We'll see how that goes. So that's it, man. That's kind of the lay of the land, and it goes by really fast.
I bet.
I do the Friday forecast on Friday, so the audience are the guests, which is really cool. And then we have some other programs and stuff, like kind of things to break the ice on Friday. And it goes fast. A lot of people show up on Thursday, and they'll book their rooms on Thursday all the way through until Monday. So if people are interested, there's a link that maybe you can stick in
absolutely.
And then if you are interested in going, you can contact the Inn of the Hills and reserve a hotel room under the Harvest Moon. We have a whole block of rooms set up for us. And if you should change your mind, you don't get charged for the room. But if you're interested in going,
that's great.
I would definitely, get a room.
Right.
So those are the details. This year I decided to try to keep the cost down so people can afford, coming out here. And I kind of got it down to really what, like my bottom line was, because I have to cover expenses and there's time involved.
Sure.
So anyway, it's probably the most democratic, user-friendly price point that I've had. Like it goes back to like the 2019 price point.
Wow.
So there you go. Yeah.
Gotcha. Right on. And I don't think we said it yet, but that's October 4th through 6th.
That's
and
right.
I'll be getting there on Thursday. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm stoked on the presentation. The theme is, Venus, and I'm going to get into Libra symbolism as well, obviously ruled by Venus. And I'm going to be doing tarot readings and everything else. And I'm looking forward just to hanging out with people. These events are really important and crucial. I think they're arguably more important now almost than ever before, at least in my lifetime. That people actually like come together and talk and just kind of commune and get to know each other and things like that. And just like what you said, it's kind of like a safe space or a safe forum or whatever. And that was huge for me, just very briefly, but just having a group of people in the Portland, Oregon area where we were really able to talk about anything and everything sort of under the sun. No one gets triggered. No one gets offended by anything, and just to have sort of that, at your disposal to be able just to kind of like freely speak your mind about what you wanted to, what you're interested in, and hearing other people's opinions about stuff, man, it really means a lot. And so that was a very valuable sort of thing that I've had around for a number of years, which I know a lot of people, they don't have community like that. Finding like-minded people like this is really difficult, right?
It is, because we're so spread out. And yeah, the internet helps, and you can, Zoom call or whatever, right? But it's not easy to, create that. We have a common friend in Ursula.
Yeah, right.
And,
totally.
And Ursula would tell me about these potlucks, and they were really important to her.
Absolutely.
Like, it really helped her get through that time that we all like look back on now, and it just seems like it's really dark.
Yeah. Right.
Really dark.
Yeah. No. They were absolutely huge for me. So. That's one of the first things when I get to know somebody who's interested in alternative information or whatever you want to call it. Do you have like a support system, or do you know people in real life that you can talk to about this kind of stuff? And so many times people are pretty much telling me that they're just kind of a lone wolf that way. So anyways, if you're in the area and you're able to do it, you should definitely come out and hang. It's going to be fun.
Even if you're not in the area.
Yeah, right? Yeah, it's worth traveling to for sure.
Yep.
Cool. I'll include all those links. One of the things I've wanted to ask you about, it's more of I think in many ways, it's a topic that you're actually, it's safer to talk about now, perhaps, than ever before, at least in my lifetime. And I want to discuss this through a symbolic sort of astrological lens. And I know you've been tracking this for a while now. But kind of the astrology of Israel and kind of like their sort of influence. And, I see them corresponding with a couple of interesting signs personally, just when I like think about the culture and the symbolism and things like that. And I'm not so much a geopolitical person, to be honest with you. But, what's happening between Israel and Palestine is something that I've tracked for a number of years now, and I've seen it flare up and then kind of go away. And now it's just really interesting that more and more people are talking about it. And people on the left side of things are discussing it, which is just interesting. A lot of people not knowing either too the full breadth of sort of the storyline here and how far back it really goes. And then just recently, Netanyahu talking to Congress, that kind of blew my mind. I don't know if you caught that whole entire thing.
I tried to avoid it, but I should probably go back and watch it. I have a really hard time listening to him. But you 52 standing ovations, right?
It was so nuts. I've never seen anything like this before. And so it was just fascinating to watch. And so I know you know a lot about this kind of stuff. And so I wanted to ask you and just kind of get your opinion on things, if you've looked into the situation from an astrological sort of symbolic lens and maybe what you see. And if you haven't done that's fine too.
Well, I mean, I would say definitely from an astrological perspective, but symbolically, what it would represent, that's something that maybe we could talk about and interpret, right? One of the things that I did I think it might have been about a week and a half ago. It was the birthday of Arthur Balfour, who drew up the agreement called the Balfour Agreement, which essentially ceded Mandate Palestine to the World Zionist Congress, right? And how that came about was that was always a part of the Ottoman Empire. In World War I, the Ottoman Empire fought with the Germans in World War I. So they had a kind of an Axis alliance. So when the Germans lost, the Ottoman Empire lost as well. And then eventually that becomes Turkey, because before that it was the Ottoman Empire. And in the sort of the tumult of this transition, they said, well, you don't own that anymore because you lost the war. So we're going to take it over, right? In at times the negative, typical negative British fashion. And they create this piece of paper, there's an actual copy of it, called the Balfour Agreement. And it's kind of based loosely on the Bible, right? Like the right of return and all that stuff. But basically saying, okay, you're going to get this territory, Mandate Palestine. And the reason why that happens, because Theodore Herzl, who was the president of the Zionist Congress, struck a deal with the English prior to all that happening. Now, the astrological part is that when you, and I didn't know this until I did it, right? The chart for Balfour and Israel's chart almost fit right on top of each other. Like, what is going on here? It's mind-blowing, right? It's like, okay, so there's some kind of astrological encoding with the guy who actually wrote the Balfour Agreement. Like the day that, and I'm convinced that they knew what they were doing astrologically.
Yeah.
Like these people are hardcore occultists, right? And they come out of basically two traditions. One is the Babylonian tradition, and the other is the Sabbatean Frankist, which is kind of related. And they both have a deep understanding of the occult, including astrology. So if you look at that chart for Israel in 1948, the sun is at 25 Taurus, right? It's a Libra rising chart. Jupiter is conjunct the galactic center at 25 degrees. And it's in the third house. Like that is a really profound placement for Jupiter in a chart. The galactic center being like this sort of the mind of God, at the center of the galaxy, which, is pulsating these neutrinos and all these other things, out into the rest of the space, right? So it's a really profound position for Jupiter. It's in its own sign, so it's in dignity. And the Libra rising is an interesting rising sign because, it can be very, very cordial, very, it operates on social code. Yes, no, thank you, right? So it's, Libra rising opens lots of doors, and so I think that's interesting, right? But then you go on the other side of the chart, of course, you have Aries, which is the back end of Libra rising, which is very different, and it's much more martial and much more aggressive, right? So the partnerships in Israel's chart are all about aggression. They're all Aries, right? So somebody's got to win. That's the nature of Aries. Somebody's got to win. Libra starts off, well, we're going to be fair, and we'll find a balanced solution. right? But on the back end, that's not really what's happening, right?
Mm.
So they always have to, again, from a chart perspective, they have to win those agreements, right?
Mm.
They have to come out on top. Then you get into the sun, which I believe is a 25 Taurus. Now that sun is occulted, and it's in the 8th house. So it's hard to get a handle on that sun, right? Like it's hidden. And well, what's really going on there?
Mm.
You know, what's happening there? You know, like what are you doing behind those closed doors of the 8th house? And the 8th house, of course, is other people's money, right? That's the 8th house.
Right.
So it's all about, you know, power and resources. So the sun there is clearly occulted, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's in third decan, which puts it in the Capricorn decan, which is all about ascent and power and hierarchy, right? And it's at the beginning of the 8th house, which I think is probably the most powerful position. Like when a planet is kind of over that line, right? It's kind of like when a planet just moves into a new sign. You know, it's really anchoring the territory of that house.
Mm-hmm.
So then you go to the top of the chart, and I believe they have a Cancer rising or Cancer midheaven on the top of the chart. And it's like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Like Cancer midheaven, you would think that it would be maybe feminine or nurturing, you know, all those kind of Cancerian traits.
Right.
Well, that's just the midheaven. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, what's the planet there that's Cancer? You quickly get into the Leo planets. Like there's a hardcore Leo stellium in the 10th house of Israel's chart, and
okay,
you have the moon, in Leo, you have Pluto in Leo, right? So I believe 1948 Moon Pluto conjunction in Leo, which is hardcore.
Mm.
Then you have Saturn in Leo, again, conjunct Pluto. And then you have Mars in Leo. So you have all this really dominant Leo energy, like in the 10th house.
Wow. Yeah.
And again, that's like being on top and
Sure.
having to win, right? Like that's what Leo wants. You know, Leo wants to be king.
Yep.
You know, Leo wants to, run the game. So when you look at the sun in Israel's 8th house, it squares their Mars in a fixed square. And that's a very intense fixed square. Very, very intense. And now you're into, power, struggle, violence, right? Like, and, unmoving. It's just like, it's not moving. Fixed sign, not willing to negotiate. Like you can see that. What's interesting
wow.
is they had the Camp David Accords, and it was with Jimmy Carter and what's the guy's name? The president of Egypt. Oh God, I'm having a blank. Abdul Nasser. And then you had Menachem Begin. So those three guys, all meet and create this partnership, basically like an accord between Egypt and Israel. And what's interesting about that is that Jimmy Carter's a Libra, right? So he's got to be able to get into that first house and theoretically negotiate this peace accord. And then not long after that, Nasser is assassinated. Right? So it's like a heavy deal. So we see this fixed square going on, and it's really being triggered right now by Uranus, which is right at, I think it's at 20, I think Uranus is at 26 degrees. So it's 1 degree off of Israel's sun, right? So it makes it really incredibly unstable and very explosive and also very radical, right? Like, willing to do things that are not going to be orthodox, right? So I've been looking at the transits for Israel for a while, and it was the same weekend where the Trump assassination happened. And I was looking at both Israel and Trump because the transits for that day were specifically for both of them, or that weekend, roughly, for that weekend. So the reason why, and this is where Israel and Trump are so entangled astrologically, Israel's Mars is almost the same degree as Trump's Mars in Leo. So they literally fit on top of each other in Trump's chart. So Trump's Mars and Israel's Mars are one Mars, right? They're like one, they're like a singularity. They're an expression that is together, right? If you listen to Trump, he's always talking about Israel. And then their sun at 25 degrees sits right on top of his midheaven, right? So they are dominating, right? They're dominating his chart. Like that position dominates his chart. Because talk about the North, right? They're sitting, you know, theoretically on the astrological North. Not specifically, but theoretically on the astrological North. So they're influencing everything in Trump's chart and in his life in a huge way. So during that time, there was a Mars transit and Uranus transit, which was squaring, they were direct on Trump's midheaven, right? And then they were also squaring Trump's Mars. And so what happens? Like there's this thing, this event that happens that weekend. And we had circled that off. Like this is the weekend to pay attention to Trump. Like this is a, you know, a very highly charged situation around Trump for that weekend. And then you could say the same thing about Israel. And then I believe it was Sunday night, right? There was this major explosion that happened in Tel Aviv. It was like this major firebomb. And I don't know if it was confirmed, but the reports that I heard was that it was the American embassy. Now, I haven't heard anything since then, right? Okay. But, you know, I think that this Uranus conjunction, which by the way runs through next year, it doesn't, you know, it'll retreat, it will retrograde, and it'll come back again. And I think that this Uranus conjunction with Israel is incredibly explosive, really explosive. Like, in some ways, almost prophetically explosive. And I'm not, I'm, you know, I'm not a big like end times Bible guy, right? Yeah. But when you kind of look at it through that lens, like you can kind of start to see some things, right? Like final judgment stuff, right? You know, like it just becomes so highly charged that they can't handle it. Like whatever that it is, like there's just too much going on. And the other thing that was like, and this now from a symbolic perspective, I may come off a little guttural here, right? But one of the big stories last week that came out was they were holding these Palestinian prisoners hostage, or not hostage, they just held them, right? And there were, you know, guys from the IDF who were sodomizing them, right? They were being sodomized, and I have a guy who comes on my show once a month, Russ Winter, does a great job. And he finds this material, and it was a very heated like conversation in Knesset, which is like their Congress. And one of these guys is saying, you know, we have to stop talking about it, right? Like we have to move beyond this. Like we can't talk about it. And he just wanted to like shove it under the rug. And this other guy said, no, we have to talk about it because it happened. And then this other guy said, there's a name for what he coined the prisoners. I believe it was Nakub, right? I think that's the word, or Nakub, Nakub. Basically like, well, they're Nakub, so they deserve it, right? Like they deserve it. Well, what is the symbology around, you know, being, you know, raped anally, Well, if you look at Taurus, Taurus is the root chakra, right? It is the root chakra. And how do you get to the root chakra? Like, you get to it through the anus. I mean, that is the grounding cord, right? That's ultimately like where your tailbone, right? The thing that all the psychics tell you, like imagine your spine going into the earth, right? Like that's the root. That's the tap root. So Taurus is the tap root of the chart. You know, we don't fully embody our consciousness until, in a weird way, we're toilet trained, right? Before we're toilet trained, we're just pure Aries. We just do whatever the fuck we want. We shit, we laugh, we cry, right? We eat, somebody else cleans it up. Just pure will unmanifest, right? Then we go into Taurus, and Taurus is symbolized by toilet training. Because you have to learn how to clench the anus, right? That is one of the things that you learn to do. You learn, like, oh, I just can't poop in my pants. Like, I got to keep this thing together till I go to a place where I can do it. That act differentiates everybody, right? We move out of this kind of blob into the root, right? So if you want to get to the root, you will penetrate the root, right? And then again, this is kind of guttural and graphic, but you get there through Uranus, right? And so we have Uranus on top of Israel's sun. And what comes out of that? Eighth house. The eighth house is all about taboo, right? It's what's hidden. It's what, we don't always want to see. The eighth house is David Lynch territory, right? It's not pleasant. A lot of times it's not pleasant. So again, symbologically, right? Like what is going on there? And it's like, and Uranus is it's not mainstream, right? It's definitely, and the other thing too is that Uranus and Taurus, or Uranus, or something you want to say it, is in its detriment, right? So Uranus and Scorpio is not in its detriment, right? So ever since Uranus went into Scorpio, I feel like we've been going through de-evolution, right? You can just see the movie Idiocracy kind of come to, and you'll see it everywhere. Like theoretically, both political parties and both sides can be equally culpable. Like when I saw those people at the Republican convention putting, bandages on them, that's fucking stupid. That's idiocracy. So Uranus and Scorpio is exalted, right? It's exalted. So Taurus being the opposite sign, it's in its detriment. So we see this kind of de-evolutionary. You can just watch it happen. You get these like, what are they? The Extinction Rebellion. What's that group?
Oh yeah.
Right. They'll like crazy glue themselves to shit.
Right. Yeah.
Because they just want all progress to stop. Right. Like just take everything away. Right. That's Uranus and Taurus. So there's ancient and there's simple, and then there's like, okay, well, we'll just tear it all down. Right. Like that's their mindset. That's total Uranus in Taurus. Greta Thunberg came of age during Uranus and Taurus. Oh,
interesting. Okay.
And it's like, what are you really saying? And you're not doing a very good job of whatever it is you're trying to do today. So yeah, that's what's going on with Israel right now. You're dealing with this Uranian factor in their eighth house. And the other thing too is that Uranus is squaring their Mars. Right, just like it's squaring Trump's Mars, and it'll come back again. It is really hyper aggressive and hyper explosive. Right, it is an uncontrolled, volatile Mars. And personally, looking at it from just a position of a transit, it's not good. It's just not good.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I mean, I'm not surprised. That would make sense. The thing about it not being good, and obviously the question of what may or may not happen here. The thing that's really intriguing to me as just a technique, I almost think about it almost like judo. The whole thing with judo is like somebody attacks and you can use their momentum against them, right? And it seems like to me that's like what the whole anti-Semitic thing kind of amounts to is when Israel gets attacked, it seems as though they've created this sort of judo technique to use momentum against them, against who's perpetrating those attacks, right?
Very much,
And
very much.
and
Yeah.
this has been something that's been sort of created over a long stretch of time, right? But I wonder too if at some point, sometimes there's too much momentum against you and there's nothing you can do about it. And so we'll see what ends up happening there. But it's a really fascinating sort of thing to kind of follow. Where I'm kind of at with everything, I mean, symbolically, and I have more of a sort of broader, I guess, understanding of things. I'm not keeping up so much with like a lot of nuances. I think that a lot of other people are perhaps. And there's still a lot of things that I'm still trying to digest myself and everything else. But a lot of people have said that culturally, symbolically, astrologically, I guess, that there's like a Saturnian influence with Israel. And people have pointed out all sorts of different things in that regard. And I remember learning about that years ago and thinking that that was pretty interesting, mainly because I see that there is Saturnian symbolism sort of baked into the culture, and there is a separation sort of thing happening with them and seemingly a lot of the things that they do, but even like Orthodox Jewish weddings, it's like man and woman, they're separated, right? There's literally like a partition, right? And then
Yeah.
Saturn being related to partitions and constraint and restrictions and things like that. And then also too, just how obviously they're treating Palestine and what's kind of going on there, this separation between like us versus them and the goy and all of that kind of stuff. But along the way, like it's almost like everywhere I kind of look, I'm like, oh, that's fascinating. Even, obviously a lot of people know that there's a Saturnian kind of black cube correspondence, and then literally there's the Teflon black cube that you put on your
Right on their
forehead.
foreheads. Right.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
And then so even the ritual with that, it almost kind of looks very Saturnian, kind of bondagey. You're wrapping that leather around your arm and everything else. The actual Star of David too, literally, if you just connect the points, it looks like a cube. It is a cube, basically.
Yeah.
The number 6 as it corresponds with all of that. But it's interesting too, Saturn as well. I mean, what I'm coming to appreciate about Saturn and this whole cube business too is that Saturn has a relationship. I did a couple of presentations called The Lost Lore of Saturn, and I talked about, and I think maybe we briefly discussed it at some point, but Saturn corresponding with the last golden age, basically. And long story short, what I kind of see with Saturn is that I almost look at potentially Saturn almost I think maybe the best metaphor for me to explain it is using growth rings on a tree. This idea of Saturn, and I tend to follow more of the traditional 7 planetary system when I tend to think of things symbolically and planetarily and everything else. But Saturn being this lumbering old planet, a lot of people associating it, obviously with Father Time and this older sort of essence. And the case that I kind of made that I think makes a lot of sense is that Saturn representing or corresponding with the golden age, its energy was different back then. People had a
Yeah.
different sort of understanding of Saturn. I
Yeah.
tend to
I
see it
agree.
as that it was possibly more feminine. I don't know if you see that. More of perhaps a crone-like sort of energy.
Mhm.
Um,
I can see
and
that.
that I see it kind of like the growth rings of the tree in that it seems as though Saturn played like a central sort of role, and then it kind of got moved out. And when you look at how a tree grows, the first growth ring is going to go further and further and further and further out, and so then
Right.
it's at the very perimeter or the circumference of the tree itself, right? And so to me, it seems like Saturn once played a central sort of role and then got moved out. And it actually was maybe one of the first planets to kind of go through this major sort of arc, or this major sort of transition,
Yeah.
this evolution, if you will, right? And also, too,
Yeah.
I think with that, like a fall from grace, you know, in a lot of ways, with how it's portrayed and how people view it, and sort of everything else. And so one of the things that I said about that is that I think it's interesting that I think when you really decode Saturn, I always used to think about it as always being the external, the exterior, almost like the shell of an egg, right? Or something along these lines, the actual walls of the cube. But the cube itself wouldn't be anything without that central sort of position in the middle of the cube, you know,
Mm-hmm.
almost like the circle with the dot in the middle of it, right? The monad,
Yeah.
or the circumpunct, if you will. So on one hand, Saturn has this symbolism related to it where it represents like the furthest sort of expanse, or the furthest sort of like the edges of something, right? The I think of the walls of a home or something along those lines, or like the shell of something. But in that, it also has a relationship with the center as well, in that that's where everything sort of expands from. So the middle of the cube is like the seventh point, or the seventh sort of yeah, not the seventh direction, but the middle of the cube represents the number 7. You have the 6 walls of the cube, the 6 directions, and then you have that central point. And so Saturn playing a role, in my opinion, with sort of the symbolic center as well. I think it's interesting that Israel plays a role in the symbolic center for a lot of people as well. It's the pilgrimage location. You know, you have the Dome of the Rock, right? And then you have the foundation stone in the Dome of the Rock. And so that central position always relates to the pole, in my opinion. It relates to the pole, the pillar, the staff, the obelisk, you know, the central mountain, the world tree, all of these different types of things, because it's a point of pivot. The center is a point of pivot, basically. And so the Kaaba cube, the black Kaaba cube in Mecca, is a point of pivot, right?
Right.
And then you go around the Kaaba cube 7 times. So in one way, the cube symbolically represents like a central stone that you do revolve around, but then it also literally represents the universe itself. And so that's what a lot of these symbols tend to represent. It's the point in the middle, but then it's also the totality literally of everything as well. So that's kind of what I've looked into, you know, with the Kaaba cube and everything else. But so this Saturnian influence, I can see it playing out in several different ways, but then also literally Jerusalem being that point of pivot for a lot of people, and being the sacred location and the pilgrimage location for a lot of people, right? And so, anyways.
Yeah, no, I think you're, well, again, if you look at their chart, so the 4th house of Israel is Capricorn, right? The 4th house is the home, right? Domicile, cultural values are infused through the home. So there you go. Ruled by Saturn, Capricorn in the 4th house. Sun in the 3rd decan, which puts it in the Capricornian decan. And then if you go up to the 10th house, you'll find Saturn. And you'll find it sandwiched between the moon and Pluto. So I think this idea of Capricorn is really a good fit. If you look at the rabbinical culture, rabbis are almost always old, right? They're almost always like, you know, got a long beard. They're almost always wearing black, which is I associate as the color of Saturn.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So to your point, I think that there's a very strong case to be made that is a very Saturnian culture in a lot of ways. Now, as far
Day of the Sabbath, sorry, Saturday, Saturn's
that's
Day.
right, Saturday, right, exactly. The history of Israel is really fascinating, you know, because you have this like period of time where like the Romans are there, right? They go in and, you know, they destroy this temple, right? And then theoretically, there's this diaspora. That's the story that we're told.
Yes, right.
What happens in between all? I mean, that's a long time ago, right? A long time ago. Somewhere along the way, again, the historical narrative is Saladin goes in there and the Muslims take over Jerusalem, right? Which leads to the Crusades. And the Crusades come in, eventually Richard the Lionhearted, you know, slaughtered a bunch of people, and he and Saladin become buddies. And they actually like carve out an agreement to share Jerusalem. That's really what happens. Like, okay, well, we'll allow you to be here just as long as you allow Christians to be here. That's how it went down. But there's really no, I mean, if in that region, we're talking about the Fertile Crescent now, if there are practicing Jews in the Fertile Crescent, right, there is a period of time where they are cohabitating with people outside of their religion, right? They're cohabitating with Muslims. They're cohabitating with Coptic Christians. Right now, we're into the story of Palestine, and what's fascinating is that if you look at like Hitler, or you look at Napoleon, like theoretically two of the greatest conquerors of so-called modern world, we'll throw Napoleon in the modern world. They did not go to Jerusalem. They went to Egypt, right? That was their pilgrimage. It was not Jerusalem. And what's fascinating, if Hitler was all that and vilely anti-Semitic, he could have easily just, had a couple of his bombers take off from Tunisia and just go bomb the shit out of Jerusalem and put a big middle finger into this whole idea of this world that would ultimately become, the repatriated home of the Israelis, right? Didn't do that. And I always found that fascinating. So there's and people will say, "Oh, this has been going on for thousands of years." Not really, right? You had an intense conflagration, theoretically, with the Romans, burned the temple down, diaspora. Some people left, and a lot happens between then and 1948, right? A lot happens. And a lot of those people cohabitated. So this whole idea that it's just this unsolvable problem, that generation after generation has had to deal with is patently false, right? And this whole idea that it was this place that held some kind of, occult mystery or power. Well, Egypt was a lot more of a draw for Hitler and Napoleon than Jerusalem was. But to your point, getting back to your point, I do believe that when Israel was repatriated by the Zionist Congress, who had cut the deal with Lord Balfour, right, that is a very Saturnian deal. Because they're dealing with theoretically somebody in the hierarchy of the British government, peerage, and nobility, right? So Saturns are always hierarchical. So they're cutting this deal with somebody who's closer to the top of the pyramid, even though he has no real right to, necessarily give the land and have these other people dispossessed. So, yeah, man. I mean, I think you make a really good case for the development of a Saturnian position on the planet. It wasn't always that, right? But it became that. And I think that's an interesting discussion.
Interesting. Yeah. No, I can definitely see that. And I'm so well aware that, what we've been taught and the mainstream interpretation of things is not accurate. As an example, just in my opinion, I think you'll be hard pressed to find like a historical case for Solomon as an example. It seems to me like there's probably he's a mythological figure that he didn't actually exist, and in my opinion too, from what I've looked into, that what people refer to as the Wailing Wall as part of the Second Temple, it's actually it was an old Roman fortress called Fort Antonia. And there's actually people in Israel that historians basically saying that wall is not at the location of where it would have been. And so it's a very controversial thing to kind of get into, but I think the narrative was flipped in that people have become convinced that this is the real Wailing Wall. This is the Second Temple. And there may not have been a first temple either. you know.
Right.
And so the idea of building this third temple as well, what I've heard from some people, some Middle Eastern people, is that the idea of a third temple is something that's never going to be fulfilled either. That it's this grand sort of storyline, this narrative, right? But it actually it's a, you know, it's a narrative that's beneficial to them for a bunch of different reasons. Even the Iron Dome, I question the Iron Dome. I don't think the Iron Dome works the way people think it works. I think it's a lot of like smoke and mirrors. I think it's kind of like fireworks. I think literally they send off essentially fireworks, they explode, and people think that they're actually intercepting missiles and things like that. And so I think that's a bit of sorcery as well. And I have to be honest with you too. I think even a lot of Israeli people, it's like they're some of the most programmed people around as well, you know.
Well, they're programmed through trauma, right? They're programmed
yes,
through trauma.
absolutely, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So there's so many things going on there that I'm not really I'm not buying personally, but it's a fascinating just weave and rabbit hole that seemingly never goes away, you know.
No,
And
it's become, you know, a major talking point in our world, in our
yeah,
culture, and the amount of power and influence and capital that has been managed to accrue since 1948 is like almost breathtaking in scope. In a lot of
yes.
ways.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. 100%. You know, the one other thing I wanted to talk about too, because I see it in a lot of symbolism connected to Judaism and everything else. But Gemini, I see so much Gemini symbolism as well. It's really, really interesting. I think of, again, whether this temple even existed or not, but the twin pillars, you know, that are classic with drawings of Solomon's temple, I
Right.
think is interesting. The Star of David, I know I just brought up the Saturnian sort of aspect with that, but then you also have, it's an upright triangle and a downward triangle. To me, that feels like Gemini symbolism.
Mhm.
Um, and even literally, I think of Gemini being ruled by Mercury, and I think of the Kabbalistic system, you know, being hermetic, and there's a lot of mercurial symbolism, you know, within Kabbalah and things like that. And so that's another sort of influence that I see very strongly. And I kind of made the case even that, you know, in the tarot, the fourth card of the major arcana, the Emperor, corresponds in many ways with Christianity. It corresponds with Aries and this Lamb of God, this sacrificial sort of lamb idea, and then Christ being crucified during Aries season, and all these different things. It corresponds with the cross. Again, it's the fourth card of the major arcana. I see the fifth card of the major arcana, the Hierophant, having eerily a lot of symbolism connected to Islam as well. The number 5 in Islam is pretty interesting and important. There's 5 pillars of Islam. The fifth one is their Hajj, their pilgrimage. And then, funny enough, I see a lot of symbolism in the sixth card of the major arcana corresponding with Judaism. So it kind of makes me wonder if the fourth, fifth, and sixth cards of the major arcana relate to the Abrahamic religions in some way, shape, or
Well,
form.
that's a really great call. I mean, yeah, I mean, that sixth card is the lovers, which is Gemini, right? Like you have
Yeah.
the masculine, the feminine, and sort of the potentiality of what is before what one makes a choice with,
Hmm.
right? Like I could totally see that. The other thing, because I kind of knew where you were going with this, and the mercurial nature, right, of Judaism, and even to a very large extent, you know, people who are Jewish, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You know, if you're Jewish, and by the way, if you are Jewish and you're watching this is not a blanket statement or assessment of how you fill out a census. But if you're Jewish, like you could either go, well, I could go other, or I could go Jewish, or I could go Caucasian. Right? That's very Gemini-like. Like it's very mercurial. You know, like for some, like if you're theoretically black, right, you're black. Like Caucasian, Caucasian, Asian, Asian. Right? You can always hit the other or whatever. But and then traditionally, like through history, you know, Jews have changed their names, whether it's because they're, theoretically persecuted,
Right.
or their English name just sounded a lot better than their Jewish name when they were acting, like Tony Curtis. I think that's a name he took on, right? Clearly, it's not his name; he's Jewish, but it's like Myron, Schwartz or something like that, right? So again, that dual persona, that person that like, okay, well, I'm going to flip my name either because it'll benefit me in Western Anglican culture, right? Or it allows me to escape the past, or it just sounds a lot better up on a marquee, right? That's that mercurial nature as well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. Great points. Yeah. So I think there's a lot potentially going on there. That what I see again. This is more of a broader sort of thing, not necessarily looking at charts or whatever.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, I like that. The other thing too, right, is like over the years, you know, um, the Jewish people have been often referred to as rootless cosmopolitans, right? Which is very mercurial,
yes.
you
Exactly.
know, and kind of always on the move, right? Always
Exactly.
on the move.
I'm
Yeah.
glad you brought that up. 100%. That's one of the things I've thought of as well. The wandering Jew sort of idea, the traveler, the wandering people. Um, as it relates to Gemini, something I wanted to bring up as well, and then perhaps we can wrap it up here. But I love to get your feedback on this because I saw that you did a show not too long ago about George Floyd, and this is something that I've kind of not avoided talking about necessarily, but I haven't mentioned it on my channel. I try and keep things a little more sort of streamlined here, I guess, with symbolism as it relates to astrology. I don't really get into world events or anything like that. But something I could not ignore years ago is how much Gemini symbolism was baked into the George Floyd incident. Did you pick up on that by chance?
Oh well, I'd like to think that I was the first person to really break ground on that because I
Oh,
have a
really?
thing with yeah, I have a thing with Gemini. I have this interesting association with Gemini, and I'm able to spot like Gemini patterns really, really well. So can I walk you through it a little bit?
Oh, please. Yeah, I've got notes here too. I recently talked to a podcaster about some of it, so it's like fresh in my mind, but it's pretty mind-blowing when you look at all of the sort of coincidences there with Gemini symbolism. But yeah, please.
So it all really starts on May 25th of 2016,
Oh yeah.
which is the Queen's birthday,
Mm.
right? Who dies on May 25th, 2016?
I don't know. Oh, good.
Prince.
Oh, okay.
Prince. What sign is Prince?
I'm not sure.
He's a Gemini,
Ah.
right? Where does he come from? The Twin Cities.
Ah.
Okay. All right. What was he known as? The Purple One. Right.
Ooh.
Okay. What was the name of his first band? The Revolution.
Mm.
The death of Prince on May 25th, 2016, is, in my estimation, a ritual sacrifice. And these things happen, right? Like, the death of Kennedy, whatever you think of Kennedy, is a ritual sacrifice, right? It's a kill king sacrifice. It's the end of Camelot, and it's the beginning of something new, right? So Prince winds up being killed on that day. All right. So we move forward. Okay, we move forward to the day after the election in 2016, and Hillary Clinton loses to Bill Clinton. I'm sorry, Donald Trump. She's up there with Bill Clinton. What color is she wearing during her concession speech? She's wearing purple.
Mm.
Purple. And as soon as I saw that color, I'm like, the color revolution is on. They are signaling where this is all going, right? So in order to get to George Floyd, you have to get through Ahmaud Arbery, right? You have to get through all these other deaths that happen along the way. And eventually they all kind of lead into George Floyd.
Wow.
Right. So George Floyd, if I'm not mistaken, is supposedly killed on May 24th, right?
25th.
So I'm sorry, it's April 25th is when Prince dies. He dies on April 25th. That is the Queen's birthday.
Gotcha.
George Floyd dies on May 24th, which is under the sign of Gemini. Right? So where is he killed, theoretically? Minneapolis. What is Minneapolis? The Twin Cities.
Right.
Right? There's this guy named Steven Jackson, who's a former professional basketball player, who comes out like a day or two after, the George Floyd thing happens, and says, he's my twin. I'm like, okay, this is like nuts. It's like nutso. Like all this Gemini and twin energy. And then in memoriam of George Floyd, they flood the world with purple light. Right?
Oh,
like
yeah.
you can look at images of purple light and George Floyd. And as far as England, they're flooding like the streets of London with this purple light. And it's the same purple light that I remember experiencing in certain places after the death of Prince. He was the Gemini. And Prince also, he did the soundtrack for the first Batman movie. And there's a famous video called Bat Dance, where he plays a combination of the Joker and Two-Face. Like, again, this really strange kind of Gemini projection. So all this Gemini stuff is just loaded to the gills. Then we hit the summer of Floyd. And this is where the revolution takes place. Like, we are undergoing a color revolution. And people don't understand what happened. Right? The same things that happened in places like Czechoslovakia, or happened in Tunisia, or happened in Egypt, right? The Arab Spring, that was our Arab Spring. Yeah. Everything that was taking place during that time, or those times for those, those countries, was happening here in this country. The toppling of statuary, right? Classic. It's a classic, sort of Marxist, Maoist power move. You're going to remove the figures that define the country or the place. Like, there's a new time, right? And the new time has no time for, these symbols of what this place stood for. That all happens, right, during the summer of Floyd. And it polarizes America, which is very Gemini, right? We're being taken through this Gemini ritual where, and even Trump plays a role in this whole thing because he's a Gemini. And when he started to deal with COVID, he has 2 executive orders, and they're on March 13th, which I believe is a Friday, if I'm not mistaken, and then April 13th. One of those days is a Friday. And the first one, I believe, basically says, we're going to let the states run their own program for COVID. And his rationale is that, well, one state may have a different set of protocols than another state, and so a one-size-fits-all model doesn't apply. But really what that does is that it splits up the country, right? Which is a very Gemini move. Like, Gemini is not about the macro. Like, Sagittarius is about the macro. Like, it's one giant overarching, cosmology for everything, right? Whereas Gemini is much more fractal. And that's what happens to the country during that time. Now, it predates George Floyd, but it's fractal. And that's what happens, right? Where is the true node astrologically during that time? It's in Gemini, right? So all these Gemini things start to pop. Where's the South node? So the true node is also known as the North node, if you want to get into the terminology, right? So the South node is in Sagittarius. So the South node is in the weak or the lesser position, right? Supposedly. It also represents the past. So with the South node in Sagittarius, what is Sagittarius known for? It's known for law, right? That's what it's known for. It's the creation of law, and to some degree, even order, right? To me, you know, the Abrahamic faiths really fall under the roof of Sagittarius because they're these overarching cosmologies. You know, the book of law, the book of rules. It's very Sagittarian. So it is in the weak or the vulnerable position. What was going on with law and order at that time? Hello? Nada, nothing, right? So what was in the ascendant or what was in the true north, you know, of the position of the moon? It's Gemini, and it becomes dominant.
Wow.
Right? So we became, and the precursor for all of this is the eclipse of 2017, which happens on August 22nd, 2017, right? August 22nd or 21st, August 21st of 2017. It's in the 28th degree of Leo. And it literally starts where you are up at Oregon is the 33rd state admitted to the Union. And it literally goes down through what would become like the Mason-Dixon line. And then it exits in Florida at the 33rd degree, right, parallel, right? So you have the 233s. That sets the stage for everything because the country is going to get cut in half. And everything that happens during that whole George Floyd super Gemini ritual is about cutting the country in half.
Right. You
know, you're to the black or white or straight or gay or left or right. It really just becomes bifurcated.
Right.
And and I started to see all these patterns very early on. And it gets into a larger pattern of Gemini, which starts with John F. Kennedy, who's a Gemini, who gets killed on 11/22.
Wow.
Right. You get the Gemini symbolism of 11 and 22, 1963 in Dallas. If you look at the word Dallas, you have the D, right? And then you have the S, and then you have the two A's on either side and the two L's right in the center, which look like 11, which look like the Twin Towers in New York City, which fall on 9/11, 2001. What's going on with that? Well, Saturn's in the sign of Gemini. So is the moon. So now we have more Gemini symbolism, right? Who is the mayor of New York at the time? Rudy Giuliani. What's his sign? Gemini. Boom.
Wow.
Who owns the World Trade Center? Larry, what's his name? Right? What sign is he? He's a Gemini. Right? You know, Donald Trump, Gemini. Who's the president at the time? You have George W. Bush, who is the son of George H.W. Bush. So you have the two Georges. What sign is George H.W. Bush? Gemini. Now, the weird thing, Larry Silverstein. So the weird thing about Larry Silverstein, again, this gets into the Gemini symbolism, so you'll dig this. So Larry Silverstein was in a bidding war with his brother-in-law for the whole World Trade Center complex. So you even have like the Gemini symbolism between these two guys. Well, so he's his brother-in-law, but his brother-in-law, he and his brother-in-law used to do real estate business together. And his brother-in-law peeled off him because he didn't like him. So now they're in this bidding war for the World Trade Center. The two, like brothers, right? And what happens? Well, Larry Silverstein's brother-in-law like drops out kind of at the last minute. Not too much, but they're pretty far down the line with the bidding process. It's just the two of them. Then he drops out. So Silverstein gets the Twin Towers. He's a Gemini, right? Was in a bidding war with his brother-in-law, more Gemini symbolism. And then what happens to the brother-in-law? He dies shortly thereafter, right? Like this guy had pretty good health, but he's gone. So this whole Gemini thing is nuts, right? It's totally nuts. And I think it is the thread and the theme of everything, right? When you get into it, right? When you get into this Gemini magic, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
And even with Freemasonry and the black and white checkerboard and all that stuff, there is something about this idea of Gemini which is crucial to understanding this realm.
Right. I totally agree with you. I'm right on board with that for sure. So a few things I just want to add. That was great, by the way, and I'm not surprised that you were on it with all of these different things. There's this great book called At the Center of the World by this fellow named John Michel. And one of the things he said was that he really gets into a lot of regions and empires that had a central location that was their sort of symbolic point of pivot. And he talks about how they would basically structure their empire or civilization. A lot of times they had a north, south, and east-west road, basically. And so they were in the middle of this big cross. But one of the things he said, this gets into this science called centrography, which is locating the center of any given sort of landmass or region or island.
You're not going to Target, are you?
No, I'm not, but we could, though.
Well, Target's based out of Minneapolis.
Oh, dang. Nice. Yeah. There's other things that we could have brought up with that. That's fascinating. There you go. Yeah.
And now you're talking about the centrology, right? The center point.
Yes.
Of that symbol. I'm sorry. I just had to jump.
No, that's freaking fantastic. Target's a whole weave, too, symbolically on it. There's so much going on there with Taurus and stuff. And so, which is right next to Gemini. But so what he said, though, was that it wasn't uncommon for ancient kings to have this quartering system of the land, north, south, east, west, and that what they would do is they would pit different sides against each other. So either east, west, or north and south. And I'm like, holy shit, when I heard that and I read that, I'm like, that's pretty amazing. The north versus the south. How many different examples are there like this? Civil War, black versus white, all this other kind of stuff. So I thought that was fascinating. It makes me wonder if some of the north versus south stuff is just not this replay of this ancient technique that these older kings used to do. So that's kind of curious. The other thing that I picked up with the George Floyd situation, the Steven Jackson thing, he said this multiple times that we were twins. In this case, there would be a good twin and then a bad twin. One twin that was successful in the NBA, and then George Floyd being the evil twin, the dark twin, if you will. But the kicker for me was knowing ahead of time that there is this relationship between brick symbolism and Gemini. So according to the ancient Babylonians, supposedly, I have this fantastic book by this guy named Gavin White. He wrote this book called Babylonian Star Lore. He says that the time of Gemini was referred to as the brick mold because they would resume baking bricks out in the sun, and then they would also resume building projects during Gemini season. So they had this relationship with bricks and Gemini, which to me that helps decode a lot of things. As an example, the sun card, you usually have two children in front of a brick wall. This brick wall, why is that brick wall there? How does this make sense? Well, you also have the mythology of Romulus and Remus being the hero twins of ancient Rome, and they are credited for building the first wall in Rome. And this is even where Romulus killed Remus. We get Rome from Romulus. And so you can see these drawings of them building this wall brick by brick or block by block, and then Romulus killing Remus. And so then you have Freemasonry, and it's about masonry, and then you have the twin pillars of Freemasonry, right? The Lover's card, which is ruled by Gemini and has a correspondence with Mercury. It didn't always used to be called the Lovers, but it was sometimes referred to as the brothers, as in Cain and Abel. And so Cain and Abel or lovers symbolism relates to twin symbolism in so many different ways, right? But the crazy thing to me was seeing that George Floyd apparently grew up in a housing project that they called the Bricks. And then I saw him one time wearing a hat, and underneath the bill it said Brick Boys. And so it's like the brick can also
Wow.
mean drugs, right? Cocaine
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
whatever else, right?
Right.
And so he is from the Bricks. He's part of this group called the Brick Boys. His father, if I'm not mistaken, was a Freemason as well.
That's
Some
what he
people
said. Stephen Jackson's a Freemason, by the way.
Oh, really? Well, yeah, exactly. There you go. They refer to each other as brothers, right?
Right.
And so brick symbolism and stone block symbolism in Freemasonry is totally a thing. But the kicker for me personally was when there were all of these pallets of bricks that
House of
showed up
Bricks.
all over the country. And
Right.
I'm like, holy cow. I'm like, this is like a full weave with Gemini stuff.
Yeah.
It absolutely blew my mind.
That is a really great like capstone to all this, right? Like the whole
Yeah.
brick thing.
The whole brick thing.
That's
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah. So I was already picking up on the brick thing, and then I noticed that, and I'm like, well, there you go. And then also, I have to say, the most famous photo of George Floyd is him in front of a brick wall. And that's all there is, just bricks right behind him.
Right.
Yeah.
There's another one of him which is less well known, but early in the days of the George Floyd decoding, it's him at this nightclub that both he and Derek Chauvin worked at, right? And it was this nightclub that went out of business. They were doing a lot of like selling of drugs, money laundering. He was one nightclub, and George Floyd was a bouncer there,
Right.
and behind him was a picture of like Corona, like the Corona beer. And of course, we were all in lockdown with coronavirus.
Right.
And the other picture, I think it might have been Kobe Bryant. It might have been Kobe Bryant in that picture. And Kobe had just died the year before, right? So it was kind of it was either Kobe Bryant or LeBron James. I can't remember which one it is. But the Corona one and one of those guys was really prevalent in that picture. And their being in the picture, it was LeBron. It was LeBron because he's the king, King James, right? And Corona, the crown. And we were going through Corona. And I think that George Floyd and LeBron James also shared the same tattoo, if I'm not mistaken. Which is I believe it's a monarch, and it's a symbolism for Boule. So they both shared the same. So now that I think of it, it was Corona, LeBron James, King James, the crown. So
gotcha.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, but that one I think got net washed because it was a pretty interesting photo.
Right. Gotcha. Yeah, there's some of these things I can't find anymore. The other day I was looking for one of the George Floyd photos. I couldn't find it at all. But yeah, so that definitely happens.
If you find this stuff, you should grab it.
Yeah, definitely.
Right?
You're right.
Like
yeah, exactly.
I was doing some research on Kamala Harris, who by the way is a Gemini rising. And this was not anything like deep or sordid. You know, there was a time when Kamala Harris was in the society pages in San Francisco, like Chronicle. And I was just trying to find, and I found this like about a year ago when I was doing this really deep dive on the Bay Area. She was a part of it. And I was able to find these images, pretty easily. I can't find them anymore. Right? Even something as innocuous as her being in the pages of the society column in the San Francisco Chronicle, they're gone. So
I believe
if you find something, grab it.
Yep, I believe it. Even photos from the Trump incident a couple of weeks ago, a few weeks ago. You can't find the same images that you used to be able to find. I had a buddy I was talking to about it. I'm like, have you seen his ear? Did you see his ear? Look at his ear. Even, you know, photos of his ear later that week or whatever. And he had a difficult time finding it, but I don't know what the deal is with that. I haven't tried to look for it myself, but I'm like, I would think that that would be really, really easy to find. But I'm sure it is all over Twitter. But maybe if you do a Google search, it's not readily available. But no, I'm right there with you.
So, what do you think of the idea of two Trumps?
Oh, I mean, I'm not opposed to that, like, at all. You know, all of these figures, you know, the whole idea of there being people being switched out, people kind of cosplaying Trump or cosplaying Biden for a little bit, there being multiple actors, things like that. I personally am not opposed to it. I haven't looked into maybe that specifically. I have looked into all sorts of other things with him, you know, years ago. Also to gender switches and things like that, you know, at birth or early on, I think is kind of common. So I personally wouldn't be surprised. Is that a
Well,
thread you're pulling at right now?
well, I mean, so a lot of people say, well, how does his ear heal so quickly? Well,
Oh,
maybe it's a different guy's ear.
oh, interesting. Right, right. Yeah. You know, I mean, with a lot of this stuff, I mean, I just think this world is way more bizarre than probably what we even think. Even the people who are far out in the way they think about things. So,
You know what this reminds me of? Like this gets right into the Gemini, like right into the freaking heart of Gemini. This reminds me of the Prestige,
mm, mm-hmm, yeah, yeah, totally. I mean, yeah, exactly.
right?
For anyone who hasn't seen it, that's worth checking out.
Yeah.
Right, right.
And it's almost like Trump has this prestige moment when he pops
Mm.
back up. But how does it get pulled off? Well, it might be revealed in the movie The Prestige.
Ah, nice, nice. Right on. Well, we'll end it at that. Robert, thank you so much for hanging out and weaving with me here and filling people in on what's going on with your Harvest Moon event. If you want to let people know where they can find you and register for that before we bounce here, please do.
So if you follow me on Twitter, it is the sign up is pinned to my profile on Twitter. I'm Astro Phoenix 9 on Twitter. And hopefully I'll send Mario that link, the sign up link. And Mario just put it into the show notes here. You can just go there.
Yeah.
And there also, if somebody is interested in sharing a room, I have somebody who can coordinate that. His name is Tom Jordan. And we've had people share rooms before. So don't let, the cost of the room or whatever. Also, the room's not that expensive. I mean, it's basic average room. I think it's around 145 or something like that. And also, if you're mobile and you have like a mobile home or you have like a camper or something, there are plenty of places that are around the area with full hookups right by the Guadalupe River. So, if you want to just do that, you can do that as well.
Awesome, awesome. Right on. Yeah, I'll put the links in the notes here. And obviously, I'm looking forward to the event, looking forward to meeting you in person and all of that. So it should be a good time. Thanks again for just being here today and all of that. And I love the way you think with everything. And if people are interested in readings and stuff like that too, obviously they should reach out
Yeah.
and get in touch. But
And I just want to say
go
thank
ahead.
you for having me on as well.
Yeah.
And I love your 40,000 foot view on things because it just keeps the space open and allows for people to kind of swim in the kind of the symbolic waters of what these things can potentially mean, but can also kind of stand on their own, right?
Mm.
And then you can have your own numinous relationship with whatever they are. So I really appreciate that.
Oh, thanks, man. No, that's great. I'm glad you like it. And obviously there's more to come with my decodes and videos and everything else. And I just try and put things out there and people can, take what resonates and leave what doesn't and everything else. I try and not be dogmatic with things or hardline with certain ideas. and whatnot. It's, me just sharing my insights and everything else. All right. Well, with that said, we'll wrap up here, and I'm sure I'll talk to you soon, and we'll be in touch. Okay.
Bye, Mario.
All right. Take care.